Hey everybody, it's Jay here for History 101. And today we're going to be doing something a little bit different. We're not going to be looking at a specific historical period. We're going to talk about why history is great. Because I'm willing to bet most of you think it's terrible. That's kind of the bad reputation that history has. If there's one word that most people use to describe this great subject, it's that it's boring. Right? With a capital freaking B and a large exclamation mark. Why? Dead people, long time ago, I'm tired. Those are most of the reasons why people think that history as a class, as a subject matter to study, is inherently boring. But I'm here to tell you otherwise because there is a history of everything. I don't care what you like, love, or hate, there is a history of it. There's a history of dance. There's a history of video games. There's a history of outer space. There's a history of novels you like. There are many histories of novels you probably hate. There's a history of everything because time plays no favorites. Everything has a past. Everything comes from somewhere and the future marches on. Which means you can write history about anything. And I hope in the classes that you take, you're going to have some freedom of movement to do that. Whatever you like, there's a history of it. I've had students who've done papers on video games and music and war and gender issues, you name it. History's there to help you because there's always a past. Now, to be a historian, if I can try and convince you that it is the most awesome subject matter of all time, being a historian means that you're a couple of different jobs wrapped into one. The one I'm going to talk about today is being a detective. Now, how awesome is that, right? Being a detective is cool. They wear trench coats. They solve crime. Woohoo. And historians are detectives of the past. Like Sherlock Holmes, we use deductive reasoning and logic, and we gather evidence and clues to try and find out what happened in the past. So, put on your Sherlock Holmes hat, and we shall carry on and talk about how we do that. When we go into the past, the number one kind of source or clue that we look for, and there are two major variants of it. We use the term sources. That's the big term, sources. What kind of sources did you use to prove your argument? What kind of sources make it clear that X, Y, and Z happened? And there's two kinds. There's primary and there's secondary. Primary are the kinds that are from the era, right? If you're studying World War II, these would be documents that were from 1939, or sources, I should say, from 1939 to 1945. That is the era from which they come. And primary sources are any documents made from that era, and they can range from things like newspapers, to diaries, to interviews with people that were there. If they're still with us, I hope they are. Those are some forms of primary sources, documents that come from that era. The other kind of sources that we use are what they call secondary sources. This gets a little bit tricky, but bear with me, I'll try to explain. Secondary sources are works, usually books, but not always, books and movies. There's a book, 3 dimensions. There are books and there are films that use primary sources to tell a story. So every textbook that you have ever read is a secondary source. It used documents like the Declaration of Independence or Martin Luther King's speeches that were from a particular era to tell a story. So they use primary sources to tell a story. And that's what history books are and documentaries are. They are secondary sources that use primary to tell their tale. Okay? For historians, the most important ones come from the time in which they're studying. So, if we have to err, it will be on primary sources. Primary sources are the gold standard. Why? The closer we can get to the documents of an era, the more honest our analysis can be, the more accurate it can be about whatever the subject matter is. Secondary sources are great, but secondary sources also come with something that primary sources don't in a very distinct way. Secondary sources, like every essay you've ever written, have an argument. And they are created by somebody who wasn't there. By someone not there. Right? The historian wasn't actually there going into a time machine to 19 whatever. They were writing about it in the present. And if you write about something in the present, secondary sources will have things like what historians like to call frame of reference. Right? Frame of reference are all the influences that make you you when you come to writing something. Your interests, your talent, and your biases. So your frame of reference will decide a lot of, what primary sources you picked, what you thought was important, where you'd put your emphasis. So secondary sources are the things that we make out of primary sources, and while they're great and we always love reading them, sort of, they are not the same for doing research as going to the primary sources, because primary sources don't have, in particular, this, and this, and this. It is believed that they are actually of the time, so they are free of the biases that historians put on all of the analysis that they use. So they're in some ways less bias. At least when it comes to being from the past. They are creatures of their time. We didn't impart our bias upon them. They've got their own biases, but they're of the era. They're not from us. So, to sum up, history is awesome because there is a history of everything. History lets you be a detective and hunt for clues in the past to find out who done it and why. And for historians, there are two kinds of sources that are integral for doing research. Primary, which is of the era and free of our bias, but it has the bias of its age. And secondary sources, which is the stuff that we make, from essays to textbooks and more, which has our biases, by virtue of our frame of reference. So, I hope you enjoyed this little look into the techniques and thinkings of how to be a historian. And I know I've probably not done enough to convince you that history truly is awesome, but that's why there's next class. All right, that's Jay for History 101. We'll see you next time in the past.